Another year of highs and lows comes to a close. Tonight, 2012, the year in review. Coming up next. Good evening, I'm Scott Shafer. Welcome to This Week in Northern California. Tonight we take a look back at the year. And joining me for that are Tom Vacar, KTVU News Consumer Editor, Paul Rogers, San Jose Mercury News Environment Writer, Tyche Hendricks, Political Editor for KQED Radio News, and Josh Richman, Bay Area News Group Political Reporter. Well, to start us off, here's a look back at some of the year's memorable moments.
I, Ross Mercury.
The year got off to a rough start for San Francisco's new sheriff, Ross Mercury, facing domestic abuse charges and a suspension. Throughout the year, politics took center stage. The presidential election, the main event, starting with 8 serious Republican candidates vying for the nomination. Ethnic voters flexed their political muscle, giving President Obama an unexpectedly early election night win over Republican rival Mitt Romney. California's public education system was saved from severe budget cuts with the November passage of Governor Brown's Proposition 30. But voters didn't say yes to all taxes. An attempt to tax soda in Richman failed, as did a statewide tobacco tax on the June ballot. New districts drawn by a citizens commission and the voter-approved top 2 primary system shook up races for Congress and the state legislature, putting a record number of freshmen in the assembly and giving Democrats a rare supermajority in Sacramento. It was the beginning of realignment of the state's criminal justice system, and voters approved reform of the state's tough 3-strike sentencing law. The economy sputtered but finally showed signs of improvement in the housing and job markets. But in Silicon Valley, the highly anticipated Facebook IPO fell flat. The city of Stockton made headlines as the largest city in the U.S. to ever file for bankruptcy. And a deadly shooting at Oikos University in Oakland left 7 people dead and a community in shock.
Where's your nose?
And Obamacare was given the seal of approval by the U.S. Supreme Court, now poised to take on Prop 8 and the Defense of Marriage Act. California's high-speed rail stayed on track, but just barely. The controversial bullet train came under fire from many sides, with funding still in question. The state parks were saved from closing, but suffered another setback when an unused surplus of millions of dollars was discovered sitting in a secret account. And there was also excitement. The Golden Gate Bridge celebrated its 75th anniversary, and the new Bay Bridge neared completion. The Mars Curiosity captured our attention and imagination, turning thoughts to the possibility of life on other planets. And with their backs against the wall, the San Francisco Giants refused to die, bringing home their 2nd World Series championship in 3 years. And of course, Belva Davis retired after hosting this show for nearly 2 decades.
Well, and that gives us a little refresher of what we've just been through this year. But Josh Richman, everything was dwarfed by the presidential election in a lot of ways. $2 billion spent. So how is history going to look back on this election, do you think? What are we going to remember about this year?
Well, I think history will look back on it as you say, a very expensive and very hard-fought election that presented a very clear ideological choice, and in the end was not really close, certainly by the Electoral College count, and even in the popular vote to some extent. The country has essentially doubled down on a lot of what President Obama has stood for in his first term and says he wants to accomplish in the second term. And some very significant gaps became clear in terms of who is where in this country in politics. You know, there's a gap among minority voters, Latino voters, Asian American voters. There's women voters are clearly dividing toward one side.
And they all voted. I mean, they
all voted.
There
was huge voter registration drives in battleground states that went into this. California is now at a record high voter registration level. There's a big technology gap that's emerging between the campaigns. You see a lot of Monday morning quarterback on the GOP side.
Well, all the tech money too that went in, and those things are related. The real connection that Obama had and the campaign had to Silicon Valley, and the money they raised.
Absolutely, we've got some good reporting done about how the volunteerism in the Silicon Valley for Obama was a huge asset to that campaign that Romney and perhaps future Republicans can't really look forward to. There were huge victories for Democrats in California House races. Two supposedly embattled Democrats in Northern California held on, John Garamendi and Jerry McNerney. Another one, Ami Bera finally unseated Dan Lundgren in his second bite at that apple. And in an interesting example of how the top two primary system is going to change things going forward in California, we said goodbye to the dean of our congressional delegation, Pete Stark, as he was unseated by a fellow Democrat, Representative-elect Eric Swalwell.
Yeah. Josh, I want to ask you about the ethnic shifts that you mentioned. I mean, it seems to me that for the last 40 to 50 years, the Republican Party has had a pretty reliable model, this Southern strategy where you have to win roughly 60% of the white vote, mostly older, appealing to certain issues, gun control, abortion, issues like that. But as the percentage of the vote has changed, going from 90% was white in 1980 that voted for president, and now it was 72%. Is there any way for the Republicans to continue using that strategy going forward, or are they going to literally have to start from scratch because there aren't enough older Southern white people anymore for them to win elections?
I think, and I think older is a big piece of it, because I think you're seeing a very definite trend toward the Democratic Party among younger voters who are coming out in bigger and bigger numbers as voter mobilization techniques improve. But yeah, there's a lot of talk now within the Republican Party about how to appeal for the first time in many cases to these constituencies that in the past they've been able to get a little piece of, but largely do without. It's hard to see how they're going to be able to win a national election or even a lot of statewide elections going forward without finding a way to make a convincing argument to attract Latinos and women and people under 30 and so on.
How do you see the Tea Party faring in the future, and this idea that you make a pledge not to raise taxes and it's for the rest of your life? What happens to those two key elements of what's happened in the election?
There are some people who wonder if Jim DeMint's resignation from the Senate toward the end of this year sort of marks the start of the downward spiral for the particular brand of conservatism that he and the Tea Partiers represented. He's sort of taking his ball and going home, although he hopes to keep influencing the debate from a think tank outside of the Senate. And I think you're starting to see that while it's possible for candidates of that stripe to win House seats, localized elections, it's going to get really, really hard for them to carry statewide elections. Look at some of the Senate races like in places like Montana, or some of the other ones where you would have thought that the conservatism
North Dakota
would be a very convincing argument, and it just didn't win out.
So is it enough for them to say, okay, let's do comprehensive immigration reform, that'll take care of the problem with Latino voters?
I think that's the first thing they're going to try. I don't think it's necessarily enough going forward. I talked recently to some Silicon Valley volunteers for Obama, technologists, as they like to call themselves. And they basically said it's hard to come to a party that's still catering to creationists, for people like us who are evidence and fact-based. It's just a basic matter of philosophy.
I think this is maybe the first election where the Latino vote really was a decisive, in the margin of victory for the Democrats. And there are folks political scientists looking at this, who will say that Latinos are really the Republicans are leaving a lot of Latino votes on the table because they're not participating in a comprehensive immigration reform, and I think that's something that we're going to start to see change. Yeah.
And let me just add to that too. You touched on it earlier, Josh. This whole idea of the divide, the economic divide, and the haves and the have-nots, and certainly Latino voters are part of the have-nots in many cases. The Occupy movement, which really got started in 2011, but it really exploded in places like Oakland earlier this year. What impact do you think that had on the national conversation?
I think it enshrined a place in the national dialogue for issues like income disparity. I mean, the whole fiscal cliff situation is very much, look at the way that's being framed, 98% versus 2%. It's very close to the 99% that was the rallying cry of Occupy. The same thing with the argument over jobs versus austerity. You know, are we going to go the way of Europe, or are we going to try to stimulate the economy back into a more comfortable spot rather than waiting for it to grow by inches as we've been doing?
Yeah. There were a lot of issues on the state ballot, of course, and Tyche, you can say that Governor Brown put all of his eggs in one basket, a basket labeled Proposition 30, and it passed. What does he get out of that?
Well, he gets forward momentum, which was, I think, really in question for a while. There were folks saying, you know, if Prop 30 is polling below 60% of the vote, that it's sunk, that you can't pass a tax measure with such a close margin. It ended up passing with a 55% to 45% margin, and it really, I think you were talking about voter turnout efforts. There was a very sophisticated effort for Prop 30 and against Prop 32 that would have restricted union political contributions, that had some union money behind it, and also a lot of organizations like Voto Latino, like Mi Familia Vota, these civic groups that are looking at engaging voters who are, in many cases, not regular voters and had been written off as we can't depend on them. And there was real grassroots energy that got them out. I think college students were a big part of the win for Prop 30. The fact that the current year's budget was built assuming that 30 was going to pass, and that if it didn't, there were going to be trigger cuts that were going to cut into the higher education budget, really motivated a lot of students out. Yeah. So Brown moves forward with that momentum.
I really feel like that's kind of the nub of it. I mean, there was a huge component of fear involved, and well-based fear involved in the Prop 30 campaign. It seemed like it finally got through to people that a tremendous percentage of the state budget is dedicated to K-12 and higher education, and you can only cut so far. And we had come to that point without impacting those sections of the budget.
What I think is so fascinating, Tyche, about the passage of that is, you know, people were scared, people voted, they decided it was worth, even though they didn't trust the legislature, it was worth giving them more money. But we've been talking in the media for the last 10 years about how California is broke. There's a structural deficit. There isn't a structural deficit anymiermore.
Well,
there's $1.9 billion.
Yeah.
That is small. It was $25 billion just a couple of years ago. This problem is a good part of the way toward being solved. And I think if people would have, I don't even think people still completely understand that. And to me, the big question is, are the Democrats, now that they have 2/3 majorities in each house, are they going to blow it up again and create new deficits like they did when Gray Davis was in charge by locking in permanent spending and rewarding unions and things like that?
Yeah, and I think, you know, the Democrats do have a supermajority in both the state Senate and the state Assembly, but a lot of those folks, the new freshmen coming in, are from more centrist districts. They won by small margins, and I don't think it's a foregone conclusion that they're going to be steamrollering with big government. Voters also passed Prop 39, which closed a corporate tax option of, some would call it a loophole to pay a lower tax. That brings another $1 billion into the state budget, and for the
Some of that's earmarked, though, right?
For the first 5 years, half of it is earmarked for green jobs, environmental things, and it looks like the legislature wants to put that into energy retrofits for schools. But going forward, it's not earmarked money.
So the supermajority and the potential budget surpluses on the horizon a year or two out, I mean, does this give Jerry Brown like a new life politically? I mean, does he, you know, what does he do with it?
A new life, but not a blank check, maybe, right?
Well, had he lost, that he might not have run again for governor. I mean, that was it would be a huge rejection of everything he had argued for, that you could bring sanity to the process, people are reasonable, they'll find a middle ground. All of that would have been in ruins. And I think now, and obviously it depends on his health now that we've learned recently about his prostate cancer, which thankfully they caught early, you could see a scenario by which he runs for re-election and he wins quite easily. Yeah. I mean, I've been wondering, given these demographic shifts, which have been underway in California as well, and the Republican Party has not adjusted to here, how long is it going to be before there is a viable candidate for governor who's a Republican? I mean, seriously, in our lifetimes, can you actually show a path where a Republican goes through the primary and wins the governorship in California?
Well, I think that's the key, the primary, because the pendulum does swing. I mean, I don't know if there's another Arnold Schwarzenegger sitting out there.
But remember, he didn't have to win a primary.
Exactly. That's why I say that.
All right.
Let me touch on another ballot measure. Tyche's mentioned several, but Prop 37, which was the GMO labeling bill, which Big Food spent an awful lot of money to defeat, Paul.
Yeah, the election, the two biggest issues for environmentalists this year were Hurricane Sandy, which actually convinced a lot of people who are on the fence about climate change that the oceans really are rising and that it can affect us, not just polar bears. And the second big thing was the elections. I mean, the re-election of Obama locked in place the doubling of the gas mileage standards, new rules that are coming out on greenhouse gases, a whole, no more offshore oil drilling in new places, things that Romney took a different view on. And in California, there were 3 or 4 big environmental measures as well. Voters in San Francisco rejected overwhelmingly a measure that would have studied draining Hendricks, I think setting back that movement decades, frankly. Second, as you mentioned, Prop 37, the GM food thing, I think that sets back that movement. They weren't able to make a compelling case to the public, even though they were outspent, that genetically modified food is harmful to eat. So I think that was part of the reason they lost.
So was the defeat of Prop 37 a victory for science or a defeat, do you think?
Well, we've been eating genetically modified food for 20 years, and there is not clear, published in scientific journals studies showing that it's unhealthy. Now, there are other problems with genetically modified food, like, for example, corporations like Monsanto that own the patents to all the seeds, like drift into organic fields, things like that. But from a health perspective, that's why the TV ads were so vague on the Yes on 37 side. They don't have the science clearly to show that people are getting sick from it.
What wasn't vague, though, was the claim that, and this is something I think a lot of people took very much to heart, that this was going to spawn a whole series of lawsuits.
Absolutely.
Against food companies and grocers and all kinds of other, and that basically this was the Plaintiff Attorneys Full-Time Employment Act, and I think a lot of people looked at that and said, well, if that's what this is about.
You're exactly right. The key part of that was that the retailer was responsible. So if you're a mom and pop grocery store and you have one product on the shelf where the maker of the product didn't label it properly, you can be sued. And we've seen it in Prop 65 and other measures where there are specialist attorneys who go around looking for little things like that they can sue on. The one other one is Prop 39, which I would just add to what Tyche said. Very, very important. California will now be spending $500 million a year for 5 years. It's more money than any state has ever spent to retrofit school buildings and other public buildings. And this is not solar panels. This is the boring stuff, the duct work, the insulation, and you can save 25% on your electricity bill. Some high schools have $100,000, $200,000 a year or more, and all that money is going back into the classroom.
So I know this year you did a lot of reporting on state parks. What kind of a year was it? There was a lot of closure talk, and then all of a sudden some money was found.
Total disaster. I blame Arnold Schwarzenegger and Jerry Brown, who played politics with this. They talked about closing parks and would save a pittance. It was a way to scare people into voting for higher taxes, and in the end, it really hurt parks because when these 2 accounts were found with $54 million that they hadn't spent. Nobody stole the money. They hadn't spent it. They hadn't reported it properly. Then the backlash was huge because the public said, why are you asking us for money and then you're holding money? That wouldn't have even been a story. And remember, it resulted in the resignation of the state parks chief, Ruth Coleman. It would not have been a story if Jerry Brown hadn't been playing politics.
And is the new chief someone who's going to fix all this, or is it
Yeah, this guy, Anthony Jackson, he's a Marine, former Marine general. And so I think, I don't know how much he knows about parks, but he's a guy who Jerry Brown can show to the public, look, we've got a no-nonsense guy who's going to whip these folks into shape.
Yeah. Well, Tom Vacar, 2011 in some ways was the year of the PG&E San Bruno explosion. 2012, we had a refinery fire in Richmond. Were there commonalities to those stories, common lessons to be learned, do you think?
Yeah, the common lesson is that whether you're a corporation or an individual, you really don't want to pay for infrastructure improvements unless you absolutely have to pay for them. And in both cases, some violent action in San Bruno and in Richmond caused them to reassess that particular thing. PG&E is so far along now in terms of upgrading its infrastructure and doing the things that it should have been doing all along, that it probably will be the model utility for the nation, if not now, in the very near future.
But short of a disaster and an explosion, I mean, is there something to motivate companies, like utilities and oil companies to
yeah,
make these moves.
Absolutely. I think the fines that PG&E is going to pay, I think the fines that Chevron surely is going to pay are going to be a shot across the bow to everybody else. You better get this in order, or at least be working on it seriously, because if we come in and find you, Southern California Edison, or San Diego Gas and Electric, or Valero, or Shell Oil, if we come in and find the similar kinds of problems here, this isn't going to be business as usual. We're not going to be chummy buddies as we were in the past. You're going to either fix this, or you're going to find yourself looking down the barrel of lawsuits. And in fact, in the Richman case, the Chevron Richman thing, two of the hottest attorneys on the planet have 4,800 clients, and they're trying to sue the pants off of Chevron. They're going to have some success.
Talking about infrastructure, the high-speed rail system was a bit of a story this year. Congress tried to kill it. Jerry Brown, full speed ahead. Where does it stand? What are we going to see in 2013?
Well, I think you're going to start to see the laying of railroad tracks. Now they're going to be out between Madera and Bakersfield, not exactly the hottest commute route in the state, but it's a beginning. And if private investors see that this might actually be something that comes around, about 20% of this money is going to have to come from private investors anyhow. And then, of course, success gives rise to new success. So if people actually see that this is working and the public really embraces it, which is yet to be determined, then what you're going to see is probably this thing move forward. But it's really too early to tell whether or not this thing is really going to have legs, but 2, 3, 5 years from now.
They've got $12 billion of the $68 billion that they need. Republicans in Congress are saying you're not getting another dime. To me, the most important thing that happened on high-speed rail this year was not the legislature approving the first slug of money this summer, but it was the realization that the billions of dollars that are going to be generated by California's global warming auctions under the AB 32 plan, that money can be spent on high-speed rail because there's a nexus between reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the train. And so that is the backstop. That's the insurance policy that they have. And it could be tens of billions of dollars that are going to go from AB 32 to fund that thing when they're not getting any more money from Washington or from the private sector.
What is it? What's missing in terms of the public awareness that emissions are problematic and that maybe something like high-speed rail is an investment?
A couple of years ago, 50% of the public believed in global warming. It's now 70%.
Well, we have just a couple minutes left, and I wanted to leave some time for predictions. And you were like Nostradamus last year, Paul, so you're going to go last this time. But so what are you looking into the crystal ball? What do you see? And Tyche, we'll go first with you.
Sure. Well, we touched on it at the beginning, but I think my prediction is that Republicans are really going to play ball on immigration reform this year in a way that they have not done, that they didn't do, in the last decade, because I think the writing is on the wall and they're starting to see it in terms of, demography is destiny and it's political destiny. And if you want those Latino votes, those Asian American votes, you need to pay attention to this issue.
To Tom's point earlier, can they do that and hold on to the Tea Party and some of the other, more right parts, conservative parts of the party? We'll have to.
We'll have to see. It'll have to be a big tent, yeah.
Maybe. Okay, Josh, how about you? What do you see?
I think at the state level, you're going to see Democrats treating their new supermajorities with care. But I think you are going to see them trying to raise some additional revenue, not with more tax rate increases, but probably by trying to close some loopholes. Some ways that don't necessarily involve a popular vote and something that'll be palatable to Jerry Brown.
All right, very good. Tom Vacar.
We will see the opening shots all year long of what is going to culminate in 2014, a vote like Proposition 103, which back in 1988 set standards for whether or not you could raise insurance rates on cars and casualty property insurance and all of that stuff. This is going to be the first time that the health insurance industry is going to be faced with this. This is a landmark bit of law. If it happens, you can expect that the money spending will start now. It will continue through the year and well into 2014, and that is going to be the big battle. And my other prediction is, if you're actually seeing this, that further predictions of the end of the world will probably not be taken as seriously.
Okay, Paul, you're batting cleanup.
Speaking of batting cleanup, Barry Bonds will not be admitted to the Baseball Hall of Fame when the results come out, nor will any of the other steroid users. But on a state political level, the two primary environmental initiatives that Jerry Brown will push next year, even with Democratic majorities, building $20 billion in new tunnels around the Delta, so-called peripheral tunnels, and reform of CEQA, California's Environmental Quality Act, the main environmental law that requires EIRs. Both of those will come up short. He'll have very little to show for that at the end of the year.
All right, and I'll actually bet cleanup. I'll make a couple predictions, host prerogative. One, I'll predict that Antonio Villaraigosa, who's termed out this year, will be appointed by President Obama as Transportation Secretary. And I also predict that there's going to be a pushback, a backlash this year to realignment. I think you're going to see, we're already seeing some rising crime rate in some of the Bay Area cities, and I think it just takes one sort of sensational kind of crime, and you're talking about a ballot measure in 2014. So we'll come back at the end of the year and see just how accurate we were. But I wish all of you a very happy new year. Hope 13 is a lucky year for all of you and your families.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
You can visit us at kqed.org/thisweek for archives of the show, to subscribe to the newsletter and podcast, and to share your thoughts and story ideas. One program note, tune in next week for Critical Condition, a half-hour special examining the crisis facing California hospitals. We'll be back January 11th. I'm Scott Shafer, wishing everyone a happy new year. Good night.